Well, I feel a little bit like James Lipton today, in 1998. I feel very, I mean, but you know what is really amazing about seeing Memento is that it is very much that is a really incredible snapshot in time for me of where you were at that time. And what is curious is how many of the themes, images, and ideas are going to find their way into the rest of your films. But why don't you set it up a little bit? Where were you at that moment? You were coming to America, right? When you...
Yeah, I was moving to Los Angeles, and I met my brother in Chicago, and we drove my dad's old car.
You didn't meet him for the first time.
Not for the first time, but he's the sort of American side of the family, and we were. My dad had kind of given me his old car that was sitting in Chicago, and so we drove it to Los Angeles, and on the course of the drive, when we'd run out of things to talk about, he told me he had a story that he was writing, this short story, and it was about this guy who had this condition, who couldn't form new memories. I'd never heard of it before, and I thought it was pretty fascinating. And he combined it with this idea of a quest for revenge, and a guy who'd taken to trying to systematize his life and put information on his body in the form of tattoos. And I immediately said, I think that would make a terrific film. Can I take that? You know, I was looking for another film to make. I said, can I take that and write a screenplay from it?
And was the curious thing about it is that then he went and developed the story on his own while you started developing the screenplay. Is that correct?
Yeah, he said he told it to me verbally, just the way you might tell someone a tale, and it was very enthralling. So I said, well, I'm going to write the screenplay. Can you send me the story when you finish it? And by the time he finished the story, I'd actually written the screenplay, shot the film, edited it, finished it. And I think it was published a week before the film actually was released.
Where was it published?
It was published in Esquire, and then in the O. Henry collection, the short story collection. And and it's a brilliant short story. The reason it took him so long was I found my way of telling the story subjectively before he did. He looked at all kinds of different ways of reordering information, all kinds of different ways of structuring this guy's story to rise to the challenge I set him. Because I said, when I'd heard his story, I said, look, that would be amazing if you could find a way that when you read the story, you're in this guy's head, if it's subjective. And I was sort of sitting around my apartment one day trying to write the script, drinking too much coffee and thinking about it and banging my head against the wall. And I suddenly realized, oh, well, if you invert the structure, if you tell it in reverse chronology, then you're denying the audience the information that the protagonist is denied. Mm-hmm. So in one sense, you're putting the audience in this guy's place.
Literally, every repetition, which is actually a different time, adds layers to it. Mm. But one of the fascinating things about it is, as well as other films of yours, how much it feels literary. And by this I don't mean to diminish how cinematic it is. Mm. I think it has the sense of the density of a literary work, and it comes partially perhaps from the use of the voiceover. That is actually not such a voiceover, it's just the juxtaposition of the two times. But I feel that this and Inception feel almost Borges-like in many ways.
Well, I'm a huge Borges fan, and I think Inception very, very much drawn, I think, from or inspired by things I've read of his. I think Memento is a strange cousin to Funes the Memorious in a way.
Yes.
But for those who don't know the story, it's about a man who remembers everything. Can't forget anything. So yeah, it's a bit of an inversion of that. And what I was after was the sort of precision of a Borges story. I think his writing naturally lends itself to a cinematic interpretation because it is all about efficiency and precision and just the bare bones of an idea.
It's quite a mathematician of the language. Borges.
Very much, yes, and structural ideas are so important to him. And I think they work incredibly well in cinema. And I think one sense, I suppose, in which I was trying for a literary approach was at the time I did Memento, at the time I did Following actually, I felt very much that films seemed to be strangely linear compared with books, compared with plays even, compared with all other media. They seemed incredibly linear. And I think Memento was very of its time in a sense. I think it came along at a time when things were becoming less like that. Home video, or DVD was just beginning with its random access and so forth. And I think I grew up in an era where you couldn't watch films in the home. other than on television. And on television, you can't stop them, you can't pause them, you can't skip around. And so our relationship to stories and storytelling in cinematic terms has now become much more like books. Yeah. And I think Memento for me was an attempt to try and create something that, particularly when we first put out the DVD, it was very much an attempt to say, okay,
it was a great artifact.
It was a great artifact, and my brother Jonah put a lot of time and attention into it with the people he worked with. And it was more like a book. It was like something you could look at and look at a section of it, skip around in it, or look at the world that sprung out from that actual initial movie.
Are you familiar with Cortázar? Julio
No.
Cortázar? I mean, because the structure of the film, actually, one of the features that was fantastic in the DVD, you could decompose it and recompose it to go linear and so forth through incredibly complicated codes. But it was fantastic because you literally could consult the movie and reorganize it.
Yeah, and I've never actually watched it that way, and I've never reordered it that way. We included it as an Easter egg on the original DVD release because for the simple reason that when they did it and they sent it to me to check whether it was okay and to get my permission for it, and I just looked at the opening sequence, which had become the closing sequence, and they had run it backwards. It was backwards, they ran it forwards. And what I got a real kick out of is that David Julian's music, for the first time in his entire career, became happy when you play it backwards. and I just found that sort of kind of thrilling. And so I said, okay, you could put it on there, but as a hidden extra. Because when we were making the film, I really didn't let anybody reorder the script. I said, you have to think of it, you have to think of this, you have to make this film thinking about the audience the whole time, thinking about, okay, how is it going to appear on screen? How does that information come to the audience?
One of the things that is fascinating, and we'll come back to the aspects that I think it shares with noir literature and noir film, and particularly LA noir, which is very, very rare, beautiful breed. But one of the things that I find fascinating is both this and Inception probably are two great examples of films that are done and find a huge audience when the common wisdom, if we can call it that, because we are being recorded and I'm being very, very proper. You know, the common wisdom of the distributors and exhibitors would say this is not going to find an audience. This is too complicated. And I'm sure that you almost must have been in some time travel in Inception where people were asking how complex it was, or is that happened?
Oh, very much. I mean, everything in the making of the film was aimed at trying to be as extreme as we could whilst connecting with an audience. And there was an enormous amount of skepticism around the project at every stage. The good thing was, with the screenplay, for example, when you showed it to people, they either loved it or they hated it. There was nothing in between, and people couldn't fake it. And so you wound up working with the right people, working with Newmarket, who financed the film. You knew that you were working with people who believed in it. And when we finished the film, we tried to get it set up with a distributor, and everybody passed. And none of the independent distributors of the time, of the day, thought that it could connect with an audience. What I had found is every time we showed it to an audience, people would get it. You know, not everybody, but people would. And as we showed it, as we took it out on the festival circuit, we started at Venice, and then went to Deauville and Toronto, then eventually Sundance. We got very, very good responses in those festival screenings. People would, they would laugh at the right things, you know, the jokes. They would sort of get into the rhythm of it very nicely, and that was a great relief to us, because for about a year we really hadn't known whether the film would ever see the light of day.
Mm-hmm. And finding, I mean, ultimately it was self-distributed, correct? Yeah.
At the end of the day, Newmarket hired a guy called Bob Burney, who's great, you know, independent.
Who is a man with a high testicular content. Big balls. I don't want to get too technical.
And yeah, they set up a distribution company that did very well with the film, and then continued after that to do better and better, and became a big force in independent distribution in the years after.
Still is, yeah. I mean, he distributed Pan's Labyrinth, and again, right. Same attitude. He said, I like it. Everybody was saying it's difficult. It's not going to find an audience. It's too complex. Is it for kids? Is it same thing? But I love the fact that as a filmmaker, there are two moments, very almost mirrors of each other, in which the essential declaration of principles for you is to be free. You know, one is on the beginning, which, believe it or not, is easier. it's easier to be free. It's like somebody says, "I will never sell out," and you say, "Well, wait until somebody's buying." You have to really wait. But I love that. Then, after your great success, you go and do an equally challenging, equally beautifully rare movie like Inception.
Well, Inception came about. I started writing it fairly soon after I finished Memento, within a year or two.
It took 9 years to.
It took a long time to write and for me to learn how to make films on the scale that I needed it to be. But it was born of a belief that when I sat, for example, in the Toronto Film Festival and watched Memento with an audience and heard them responding to it in a very, very mainstream way, in a very clear-cut, communicative, relationship between the audience and the story, I felt like you could do that on a big scale. You could do a big version of that, and people would get it. They would respond to it, and I've held that belief for a very long time. And Inception represented my big gamble in that sense.
But it's rare. It's rare that a filmmaker can find success and remain rare. It's truly beautiful when a filmmaker finds success, and the big success is to remain strange. And I think that's to be celebrated. But one of the things that is incredibly impressive about Memento is, well, it's aged fabulously, but the language of it, much like Borges, who, like Stevenson, they are both incredibly precise writers. This is written filmically in an incredibly precise way. It's actually daunting to think this is your second feature. It's scary, and I kind of hate you in many ways. So. Just for me to take notes, can you tell me how, because it's a film that is full of emotion. That's all the films you do are incredibly precise, but full with emotion. So does your process include an incredible planning on the formal part of the movie, and then you find freedom with the actors?
I think for me, the writing process is a combination of attacking it from two different sides. I'll draw diagrams, I'll plan, I'll think about it, but then I try and write from the inside. And I write, like with Memento, I started on page 1 and I finished on page 120 or whatever. Like, I always wrote in order, and generally what I do is I write to the point where I get stuck, then I go back to the beginning and I rewrite as I go. So the first draft tends to be fairly finished. It's usually over long, but it tends to be very, very close to what it is I want to then go and film. But as far as the emotionalism goes, I really believe, and I've talked about this in the past, but I really believe that in the case of Memento, I think it was very much Guy Pearce's performance that opened the film up emotionally for people. I think that when I wrote it in a very cold way. I wrote it as a puzzle. I was interested in the puzzle of it. And then when we came to make it, like Borges, and it was more in a distant way. And what Guy brought to it is he took on the challenge of not treating it as a puzzle, but treating Leonard as a man and his emotions and what would the reality of that situation be. And so in doing that, he just opened up the truth of that situation for an audience. And I had, in trying to be clever in a sense, I'd sort of grasped at these tropes from film noir and crime fiction, Jim Thompson, people like that. But I had done it, I think, in a quite intellectual way, if you like. What Guy did is he made it emotional for an audience. And that opened the film up in a way that I valued tremendously, and it changed the way I write. So when I wrote Inception, for example, I did write from a much more emotional point of view because I realized that that's really what the audience connects with in the immediate moment of the images passing before them, and that the structural ideas, the sort of superstructure of things, has a different role and different strengths.
So a guy is an incredibly exacting actor. He's not a guy that is content with the briefest explanation. He likes
to delve into it. He really likes to know. He likes to know exactly what's behind something, especially if you've written the script yourself. And I found that invigorating because Memento was a complex and confusing script for a lot of people, but the precision with which he would analyze it and he would ask me questions, really, he became an incredible logic filter on the piece and really ensured that it held together as well as it could.
And he's a guy that is restless until he finds the truth.
Yes.
I've found. I mean, he's truly, genuinely restless with himself unless he knows.
I think the best actors are. I think the best actors like Guy and many others I've worked with, Christian and Leo, so many others, they are restless. I think that's a very good way of putting it. They're looking for something and they're looking for the truth of the character and the essential truths of that. And until they can pin that down, they are just searching and searching. And then even while they're shooting, sometimes they are as well. But when they find it, it's a wonderful thing to watch an actor just settle into that.
Yes, and he, you were talking about the real emotion. What is beautiful about, well, I think if you find a unifying thing in your films, is that they are very much incredibly complex, labyrinthian journeys in many cases of lonely characters that stand alone, and they go through that labyrinthian journey in a beautifully, you said, it's almost visual, a very diagrammatic way, like a Mobius strip or the impossible staircase in Inception is almost like a creation of impossible perspectives meeting mathematically at a point where they become a film. But what is great is emotionally the movies are real. And this is, however, they are emotionally real in works of genre. Like I always say, there will always be something in me that will always be pulp. Mm-hmm. And there's something, the movie works, but it doesn't pretend to be a reality. It tries to be truthful with the emotions.
Yes.
But he is the best tattooing insurance agent I've ever met. He's truly a fabulous tattoo artist. And but the reality is, I think that there is a tone wisdom in finding people like Joey Pants and putting him in there, because he himself is a huge question mark about his integrity, and it works. I wanted to ask you about this. It works deeply in the noir genre, because one of the things is unreliability, and because of his disease, everything is unreliable in the movie.
Well, certainly the unreliable narrator, particularly in noir, I think is something I'm fascinated by, and finding a character, creating a character who is by definition unreliable, but is fooling himself that he's not, and so you're kind of peeling him away through the film, was really fascinating to me. And one of the things I enjoyed shooting the most was there's a moment where he's in Carrie Ann Moss's house and he's got his set of files with the big rubber band around him. I very much like that rubber band. It's a nice thick one they found in the prop department. He sort of pulls it off and he's got all these files. And what we did with the camera is we just gradually changed the elevation of it to reflect a shift in point of view. And it's the one time in the film where you really sort of see him from outside, and you see her you see him from her point of view. Mm-hmm. And he's just this self-delusional guy. He's a guy who can't possibly perform this investigation, who can't possibly succeed. And there's something, I think there's a lot of pathos in that. Like, I enjoyed that moment and shifting that point of view there.
But the revelations, everything is, you talk about a very literary resource that Nabokov uses beautifully and noir uses beautifully, which is the unreliable narrator. But if you pull back a little bit, actually that central character is unreliable, but the narrator, which in this case would be you, has to be incredibly reliable. The movie is constructed in such a way that you don't find the usual wait a moment. Moments after
cheat.
The moment. You cannot cheat.
No, you couldn't cheat. When you take a structure like this, and Inception is very much the same, when you're demanding of the audience that they engage with this game in a way, with this puzzle, it's very important that you not cheat. And I think it's also very important that you provide answers. And there are plenty of ambiguities in the film, but the ambiguities themselves are answers, I suppose, is the way to put it best, that it's very clear to the audience the things that they can't know, in a sense. And I think that is an important part of it. Is the narrator is indeed unreliable, but you have to feel there's an authority behind the film that knows what's going on. And indeed, I have a very precise interpretation of everything in the film, and it was constructed according to that. When we first went to film festivals with it, I would happily explain that. And at Venice, my brother came up to me afterwards and he said, "You can't do that." And I said, "Really? Why not?" And he said, he made the point. He said, "You've made a film where it's ambiguous at the end, specifically because you're in the point of view, you're in the head of a guy who can't know the truth. And so the audience doesn't know the truth at the end. And if you tell people what, as the creator, that truth is, you're actually violating the terms of the story. And will make much more money if you don't tell people." So, combination of both those things. I think he was right.
I feel brother envy right now. But your brother, you became close collaborators after this. Were you that way as kids, or?
Well, Jonah's six years younger than me, so
did you
quite
beat the shit out of him?
I wouldn't say that. He might tell a different story. He's not here to defend himself. But No, we were certainly close, but it wasn't until Memento that we started working together. And he's just an incredible writer. And it really wasn't until, I think it was when I was making Following, actually, I showed him the script and we talked about it, even though he didn't help me write it, but he had a lot of great input into how I should go about making that. And I started to realize that my little kid brother had figured some things out and really had a talent, and I've exploited him mercilessly ever since.
But the beauty about the movie, and it's frankly very rare of movies of this time, there was a kind of revival of neo-noir, you may call it, if you want, right at the end of the 90s, all the way to the middle of the 2000s. And most of them, frankly, for me, feel, first of all, they age very rapidly. And they feel fake. They feel imposed, and they don't feel done with any other attitude than postmodern sort of attitude. This one is genuine.
Well, I think that's because I think the movement you talk about stemmed very much from Tarantino and his work in the 90s. And certainly for me, I found his work very exciting, and it pushed me to read a lot of the source material, starting with Elmore Leonard and then reading the books of James Ellroy and Jim Thompson further back. And I spent years reading a lot of crime fiction. And I think that if Memento holds up a little better than some of the other neo-noir of the time, it's probably because I did actually go to the books rather than the movies, because there's a limit to, well, particularly when Tarantino's work is already ironic and already retro in that sense. A reflection of it. Yeah, so then you're reflecting a reflection if you're looking at the movie sensibility. But I think he certainly inspired me to look into the literary origins of the genre. And once you engage with the books of the time, I think Jim Thompson is the guy I keep coming back to as the strongest. Putting together.
He's a tough guy.
He's very tough, very tough, and this film's nowhere near as tough as his, except in the extremity of the guy's situation. But it's this idea of character defined through action. It's this idea that you put a group of, usually a triangle of people together, and you see what they all do to each other, and at the end of the story you try and figure out who was good and who was bad and who was evil and who was okay.
James M. Cain, did you go to him? Because he's the expert at insurance.
Yeah,
scams.
Very much. Well, insurance just double indemnity as well. That whole we definitely were pulling out the touchstones of the tropes of the books and movies of that.
But the characters are very much out of a noir. I mean, literally.
Oh yeah.
She is out of a noir. He is out of a noir.
Yeah.
Everybody.
Totally. And the idea is, you sit there as a young filmmaker without much to tell about your own life. And so for me, film noir became a very interesting way of extrapolating from your own experience and elevating it, in a sense, to the level of melodrama, if you like. So the femme fatale, reflecting the neurosis about your own relationships or, whatever, that kind of thing. And in becoming melodrama, which is, it's too pejorative a term really, but it is melodrama. It's heightened reality.
Yes.
It's like what you were talking about earlier. It's not meant to be naturalistic. It's meant to be truthful within the terms of that genre, and that makes it more universal. That means more people can connect with it.
One of the things that goes largely unrecognized because it's so good is the dialogue in the movie. It really is stupefying for me. Whenever I watch it, the dialogue is phenomenal. The rhythm of it is fantastic. Is incredibly smart, but it doesn't feel like repartee in a movie. It doesn't feel smart in a postmodern way. It's just smart because the characters are incredibly challenging.
Well, I found, I'm not the writer of the family, my brother is. And when I started writing screenplays, I tried writing good dialogue, and it never worked. It was horrible to look at and sounded incredibly forced. And I've never been comfortable with, I couldn't write a novel because I've never been comfortable with an authorial voice or the tone of what that would be. But what I found in the screenplay form is that if you then went back and you just took out all the bits you thought were good, what you were left with was actually much more useful in terms of communicating, and just trying to write from the point of view of what are these people feeling, what do they need to express in the moment. So more and more, I just try and strip everything out that isn't essential.
Mm-hmm. What is really remarkable is that the character of Guy is almost a vector. He has such certainty, and this is true of every great revenge story. It's true of Monte Cristo, as it's true of Memento. He's almost a vector that feels so righteous and so full of entitlement that he manages to have everybody around him take advantage of him and use him literally like a weapon. And one of the most fascinating creatures in the movie, and I use the word creature accurately is Joey Pants, you
Yeah.
know, who is a very ironic character, who seems the most dishonest of them, and is perhaps one of the most endearing in the movie.
Well, I think he's endearing. He has a lot of emotional warmth, really, because he's a guy. He's really his only friend, but it's obviously an extremely dysfunctional friendship. But I really like the idea of Joey Pants, particularly playing this character who, at the end, you know, you sit through the 2 hours of the movie, and right near the end, he has that line where he just turns around, he's explaining what's going on, and he says, "Are you sure?" Mm-hmm. And seeing Joey Pants say that, and knowing that for all of us in the audience watching it, he's the last person you want to be hanging on as having the truth of the entire story you've seen. Exactly. And sort of for him to be the only guy who really knows what's going on, and he's telling you a version of it, and you're in the position of the protagonist, is that you can't know. I just thought he was the perfect character and the perfect actor to play it, to hang that moment on.
And because like noir, and then I think this will be my last question, we'll open to the audience, but and unlike in every great noir, you play with a finite number of characters. It becomes almost like a chamber piece.
Yes.
So casting is incredible. First of all, casting is one of the strengths, and at the risk of sounding like Lipton, one of your great advantages. You know, so casting this movie is quite. You were in a state of grace. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to be in contact with these actors, with Carrie and Moss and so on?
Yeah, it was an interesting film to cast because it is a triangle. It's a very specifically, I mean, there are other characters, but it's so strong on the three. Interestingly, Carrie Ann Moss was actually the first actor that we cast. And
Before Guy?
Before Guy.
Wow.
She was very hot off the first Matrix at the time, and just liked the script, responded to it, and was someone I wanted to work with. And she came on board early on and said she would do it, you know, and then we went out to cast. And then I met Joey Pants through her.
Because of the of Matrix.
Because of the Matrix. Yes. And so, you know, she was friends with Joey and thought he'd be good for it and whatever. And I met Joey and thought I didn't want to cast him. And for a long time, tried to cast everybody else. But he sort of hung in there and knew I would come around eventually, as I did. And then Guy... I met with him and sat and talked about the script, and he wasn't at all what I'd had in mind. I'd imagined somebody older, with more obviously a history to him. Guy was quite young, and when I spoke to him, I realized that he just had such a passion for the script. He tapped into something with it that was clearly very important to him, and you just go with that. You know, you say, okay, I had something else in my head or whatever, but he seemed absolutely perfect.
There is a great moment, and then we'll open it. There's a great, beautiful calculation in the way you reveal the big visual motif in the movie, which is his tattooed chest, and how it happens. It's really building to that. It happens around minute 15 of the film, and it's fabulous how you hint at it and bait the audience into it.
Well, the fun thing is you get to discover it with him.
Yes.
And that seemed a very unusual thing to do. So he sees the thing on his hand and thinks it's written there, so he tries to wash it off and can't, and then he sees a little trace of it. And that was always something I thought would be really fun, is to put the audience into this guy's shoes, and he doesn't even know, he can't even trust his own body anymore.
That happens to me all the time. So we open to the audience. We have 4 questions, and they cannot be about Batman or The Hobbit. So use them wisely, all right? So we start, that's one. Yes.
There was this French website which had a list of films which they claimed, and I was wondering.
I'm often quoted as being a huge fan of like the black hole, you know, the black hole. And it's because I once did an interview for Film Comment, I think it was, and they have a column called Guilty Pleasures. So I listed 5 guilty pleasure films, but then that gets reported as these are the favourite films, and you've based your whole career on it, you know, whatever. So I'm not sure I've ever really given a list of my 10 sort of most influential favourite films.
The director of Paprika, before he passed away, listed TDK as one of his favourites, and I just thought you'd.
Oh, that's nice to hear. I'll have to check it
Satoshi
out.
Kon was truly a great guy.
Yeah, that's what I hear.
Next question. You.
Well, the film had to be edited pretty closely in structural terms. You know, all of the inverted chronology had to be there in the script for it to work. But really what we found, Dodie Dawn, my editor, and myself, was the emotional life of the story. And particularly, the thing I remember being extremely happy with it, we shot a lot of footage, not knowing what we'd do with it, of his wife and of her in the house and moving around this house. We have this nice craftsman house we shot in. And finding out how to use that imagery, where to put it. I mean, there's one sequence where it's clearly meant to be there, where he's literally remembering her. But then I remember Dodie starting to use it towards the end, just cross-cutting it with what was going on. I remember that really adding a great emotional dimension to things for me. And then the structure at the beginning, we found ways to... The screenplay had been more fragmented for the first 10 minutes or so. And as with all my films that have had non-linear structures, we wound up actually simplifying that in the edit suite so that the audience would have a little more time to find their feet with the material before you fragment it.
And this movie also starts a series of collaborations that you're going to continue through the years. Emma is there, sort of not in the forefront, but is there, and she's crucial in giving the screenplay to the right people. And so you're a photographer. You did the DOP work in your first, in the short and the first movie, correct?
Yeah, I shot following myself, and then we talked to a lot of different DPs about shooting Memento and found Wally Pfister, who, one of the things I love about Wally is he comes from a news background, documentary background, and so he'd operate camera himself, and that kept me closer to the camera work than it would have been if we'd had, you know, a DP and an operator, etc., etc.
A completely academic
yeah.
structure.
And so that's been a very strong collaboration. And David Julian, who did the music, I worked with for years and did, you know, the Prestige and Insomnia for me. So yeah, it's a tight group of people.
Yeah. Third question, you?
Hi. In the future, do you think IMAX cameras will be small enough and quiet enough for you to shoot a film like Memento, an intimate drama?
I think probably with all the R&D that's bled off film and gone into digital imaging, I think it's unlikely that we'd ever be able to get the IMAX film camera as quiet. I mean, it's, you know, 100 years of cinema has gone into that camera and it still sounds like a generator. But it is an incredible tool. There's no other imaging tool to match it. And so I'm not sure you could ever use it in a really intimate setting, and you need to mix it with 35 or 65mm 5-perf. But it's an incredible tool for creating an expansive canvas for a film. There's really nothing quite like it.
And finally, this is a big responsibility. You know?
Are there any films that specifically influenced the making of this film or your other films?
Favorite filmmakers, perhaps?
Sure.
Well, I mean, the guy I always talk about first is Ridley Scott, because I was so struck by Blade Runner when I saw it. And when I look at this film again, I think there's so much concern with memory and identity that I carried over from that film, because it just made an incredible impression on me. I saw it at a time when I was becoming very, very interested in films and what I could do with films, and it really stuck with me. I also see a lot of, you know, attempt to do what I saw Terrence Malick doing in terms of his portrayal of mental state or memory. If you watch The Thin Red Line, that was a revelation to me, that film, because, you know, where he's cutting to memories and flashbacks with simple cuts. There's no, you know, wavy lines, no dissolves or whatever. And so the scene where, or the moments where, you know, Guy's character is remembering his wife, were taken very much from that film, because when I saw that film I thought, okay, that's all you have to do is put the cut in the right place and have the right image, and you can represent the process of memory.
With Blade Runner, do you have an opinion on that ending? I know you won't give your opinion on Inception, but is he a replicant of that?
Here's the problem, and this is why I don't answer this question about my own films, because Ridley Scott has said that he thinks Deckard is a replicant. So you're not really free, you know, I'm not going to argue with him. You know, he should know.
But Harrison Ford said otherwise, so...
Well, it's director's medium, isn't it?
Well, I think, is that, are we screwed out of time? Well, you know, fuck it, let's do one more.
What's been the most challenging thing for you as a director, kind of coming from the small budget world to your latest film? It's been huge. Has that change kind of been very easy for you? Has it been difficult?
It's the sense at which it's been easy for me is that it's been a very natural and gradual progression from, you know, my first film cost, you know, $6,000, and the next one was, you know, $3.5 million or something, and then 45 million, and then I'm not allowed to talk about it. So, So it was a very even progression, which was quite helpful. The real challenge is retaining the spontaneity. You know what I mean? Like retaining the energy and the excitement. We were talking about this earlier of what you did when you were young and you're starting out and you had nothing to lose.
And the madness.
And the madness, exactly. And not allowing the massive machinery, you know, suddenly instead of a little sailboat, you've got an oil tanker to steer. But keeping that mobile, keeping that fresh, keeping it spontaneous. And one of the reasons I've kept a tight team of people together and we've tried to carry on working the same way is they know what's important to me in that regard, and we want to create a space for the actors to be able to really find the truth of things and not let things get locked down, even though the machinery is now very weighty. And that's been the biggest challenge, but it's also been great fun to try and explore that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming. We bid you farewell. Thank you. Celebrate Memento.
Thank you. That was terrific.